We are in Daniel chapter 6. We're looking at the whole chapter here because it kind of all flows together. Chapter 6, 1 through 28. By the way, Teresa, how's Jeff doing? Is he getting out today or tomorrow? Okay, well, we're continuing to pray for Jeff Swanson, who's been in rehab here, so keep him in prayer. All right, Daniel 6, and I've titled this Daniel in the Lion's Den. Lord, again, we thank you for your word. Speak to our hearts as we study now. Pray in Jesus' name, amen. On the overhead, you see the theme is God is sovereign over history. We'll see that again this morning. And then as far as the outline, you have a personal history of Daniel chapter 1 as far as introduction to the book. And then the prophetic history of the Gentiles, chapters 2 through 7. Daniel 2 through 7 is really about the place of the Jews in what Jesus termed the times of the Gentiles. Well, during this time, the Gentiles would oppress the Jews. And yet, the God of the Jews reveals himself to still be totally sovereign. The times of the Gentiles began with Babylon taking the Jews captive and continues on throughout history until the second coming of Christ. Real briefly, and we'll look at this in detail as we get into chapter 7. But we have a broad outline of Gentile history where they would dominate the Jews, as given in chapter 2 of Daniel. We see there Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Of course, Rome has two phases, the revived form at the end there, out of which will come the Antichrist. But the details will be spelled out much more clearly as we get to chapter 7. But, of course, the times of the Gentiles comes to a conclusion at the second coming. And as Christ comes, he sets up his kingdom, which will be an eternal kingdom. Well, the pagan Gentiles believed that whenever they took over another people, it showed that their gods were stronger than those of the people that they had conquered. But the God of Israel stepped in early to show, in the case of the Jews being taken captive to Babylon, that was not the case here. God intervened dramatically in the lives of the leadership, both in Babylon and then of the Medes and the Persians, to make it unmistakably clear that although his people were in captivity, under oppression, yet he was still the one true sovereign God. Daniel 2:4b through chapter 7 was written in Aramaic, the language of the Gentiles. God wanted the key message of his sovereignty made known to these Gentiles. He made it known to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 2, 3, and 4. He made it known to Belshazzar, Daniel 5. And now in our study today, we see he made it clear to Darius the Mede, the Medo-Persian leader, in chapter 6. At the end of Daniel 5, we saw the fall of Babylon in 539 BC to the Medes and the Persians. The events in Daniel 6 probably took place shortly after that, within a year or two after that, in the context of the Medo-Persian Empire, which has now succeeded the Babylonian Empire. Daniel at this point was an old man. You do the math, he was probably in his 80s, his early 80s, probably around 82, 83. Daniel 5 concludes with Darius the Mede being made king over the realm of what was previously Babylon. Chapter 6 now continues on from there. Verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these three governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. Darius really was a sub-ruler under Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus was the major leader. But he did have a rather large area that he controlled, involving much of the territory previously ruled by Babylon. And he set up over this large region 120 satraps. As I said last week, there's been no end of discussion over who Darius was. He is definitely not to be confused with Darius the Great later in history, who became a king of Persia. He was not that. Some think that Darius was simply another name for Cyrus. An argument for this is in verse 28, which could be translated as during the reign of Darius, even Cyrus the Persian. The problem is that Cyrus was Persian and Darius was a Mede, as we saw last week. So that really doesn't fit. Some think Darius was Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. However, that didn't really historically happen until a little later in the reign of Cyrus. Most probably, Darius was an official known as Gubaru in ancient documents, whom Cyrus appointed as ruler over Babylon immediately after its capture. We see in Daniel 9:1, for example, that Darius, was made king. Not like he was the conquering emperor who took over. No, he was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. Darius was an honorific title, meaning holder of the scepter, which archaeologists have found common on various inscriptions related to various Persian rulers. Ranald Shower says the ancient annalistic table of Cyrus stated that Gubaru, quote, appointed governors in Babylon. Well, that would be consistent here. The word satrap means protector of the kingdom. Satraps were rulers over various provinces, responsible for law and order and the collection of taxes. Well, Darius set 120 of them in place in his assigned jurisdiction over various areas related to what was formerly the Babylonian Chaldean Empire. Over these 120 satrap rulers, Darius appointed 3 overseeing governors, of whom one was Daniel. Now, they evidently were responsible for making sure the revenue from the taxes was properly collected and accounted for. This would have been a high call and demanded that these men be men of honesty and integrity. Amazingly, Daniel was so quickly recognized as such a man and appointed to such a role. Daniel was so impressive that very quickly people saw that he was an outstanding individual. We see this throughout his life, even from the time he was a young man. Verse 3, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Wow. He not only wants to make him one of the 3, he's thinking of putting him over the whole realm, his whole realm. So he was very much distinguished. And Darius gives consideration to putting him in this role overall. Well, Darius was obviously very impressed with his character and his ability. And of course, we know that the hand of God was upon Daniel in a very special way. However, there was one little problem in the kingdom, a problem with jealousy on the part of the other governors. And some suggest that Daniel may have been a little too honest for their liking. They may very well have wanted to kind of bilk the system a little bit, but Daniel, being a man of character, would have none of it. Another problem, it seems that they had some anti-Semitism in them. They had a problem with this Jew being elevated to such a high position. Whatever all was involved, these other leaders wanted Daniel out. Verse 4, so the governor satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. What a great testimony. When your enemies can't find any dirt on you, that is amazing. Concerning his work in the kingdom, he was flawless. They could find no charge that would stick. The reason, he was faithful. There was no scandal or blunder, no area in his public service that they could point out and say, you know, he's really messed up here. They evidently couldn't even charge him with slowing down because of his age. They, by their own admission, had nothing. Verse 5. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. He's very pious. He's very religious. He's very committed to his God. We need to find something there. Daniel's testimony and commitment to God stood out. They all knew where he stood. And they knew if they're going to find anything on him, it would have to be to concoct a situation where it was God, Daniel's God, versus his commitment to government. They knew exactly where Daniel's number one loyalty lay. His stand for God was consistent and predictable, and therefore they reasoned that if they could somehow play off his stand for God against the law of the king, they could trip him up. And so they hatched this plot. Verse 6, So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. Poised with this devious plot, they thronged before the king. And they arrived, it would seem, with great commotion, excitement, acting as if they had come up with a really special idea to honor the king. They came all respectful, addressing the king with honor. King Darius, live forever. Verse 7, all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors, advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, wasn't that nice? I mean, they were here to honor the king. They're thinking about honoring the king. That's all that's on their minds, of course. And they've come up with a very great idea to do this very thing. Of course, the whole thing was a charade. It was very deceptive. And they start out with a flagrant lie by saying, all the governors, administrators, satraps, counselors, advisors have come up with this royal statute. There's a consensus, a total consensus here, is what they're saying. But what about Daniel? I mean, he was the leading figure in the kingdom under the king himself, certainly in the king's mind, but he wasn't in on it. His endorsement was quietly left out. This proposed royal statute to honor the king was that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except for the king, was to be thrown into the lion's den. In other words, prayer was to be made only to the king. In effect, they were saying, we think so much of you, Mr. King, live forever, that we want you to play God for a month. No one can pray, no one can petition, that's the idea of praying. No one can pray to any other person or God for a whole month, except to you, O king. That's how much we think of you. Now, the petitions involved were understood to be of a religious nature. That's why they bring a God into the equation. The king alone was to be looked on as the higher power during this period. Thus, allegiance to him was to be supreme above all other people or any other god whatsoever. For 30 days, that's the kind of honor that is to be given to the king. This was pure flattery. By the way, flattery is a very devious way of manipulating someone. Proverbs 29:5, a man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. That's what they're doing. You see, flattery is insincere praise with ulterior motives. It's manipulative. It says wonderful things to a person's face, but doesn't really mean them because it has a self-agenda. Well, they came up with this royal statute by which everyone could show their really worshipful allegiance to the king, and now all it needed was the king's signature to put it into law. Verse 8, now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. The boast of the law of the Medes and Persians was that when the king signed something into law, it could never be changed. It was then set in stone. The law was then considered to be inspired by the gods and therefore irrevocable. To violate this would be to incur the wrath of the gods, supposedly. So in the name of honoring the king as above all, really as a god for a month, they urged the king to sign the decree, to sign it into law, emphasizing it could not be altered. And they're emphasizing this. This is part of it, that emphasis, the law of the Medes and Persians. It can't be changed. Once it's signed, it can't be changed. A footnote here. The Medo-Persian kings did not have the same absolute power wielded by Nebuchadnezzar. He could arbitrarily decide or change anything he wanted at any time. But Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. The Medo-Persians were only of silver. In the Medo-Persian system, the king was not above the law, not even the law of his own making. In that sense, the kingdom of silver was inferior to the kingdom of gold that preceded it. Verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Flattery won the day. Now, with an irrevocable system, you might want to think through very carefully what you're signing. You might not want to do anything rashly. But all caught up in the emotion and the flattery of what is happening, the king signed the decree. Verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since his early days. Daniel didn't miss a beat. He knew exactly what was happening, and he acted on principle without hesitation. He was a man of no compromise, and he had long ago counted the cost, and in his mind, God was above all, including the government that at this point made laws that violated his relationship with God. As a man of prayer, he would not compromise his prayer life. And we see this principle reiterated in the New Testament. Acts 5:29, Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. That's the principle. Yes, we ought to obey the laws of government at every point, unless there is a conflict with God's higher law. In this case, they essentially outlawed prayer to God. Well, for Daniel, that wouldn't stand. He had been a man of prayer for many years, indicated here by the language, as was his custom since his early days. Someone once said, and I want you to think about this because this requires a little bit of thought. Someone once said, a lot of crimes are not sins, and a lot of sins are not crimes. Well, that requires some thought, doesn't it? It was a supposed crime for Daniel to pray, but it was no sin. It was really sinful what the plotters were doing, but it was no official crime. The world is often upside down. In view was sinful lawfare. It was clearly morally wrong before God, although legally proper. As David said regarding the depravity of man, both the inward thought and the heart of men are deep, deeply dark and depraved. But for the man of prayer, it didn't matter. It didn't matter what laws they passed. He was going to pray. Here we see part, I think, of the secret of his exemplary life. He was a man of prayer day in and day out since he was a young man. Now, he wasn't really making a show out of it. I mean, he went to his house. He wasn't hiding it either. His windows were open. He was not ashamed. Jews out of the land, which they were at this point, prayed toward Jerusalem in accordance with what Solomon instructed. In 1 Kings chapter 8, we read, and when they returned to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies, and that's where they were, who led them away captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you gave to their fathers, the city which you have chosen, and the temple which I have built for your name. So praying toward Jerusalem had significance because the Temple Mount was there. The Holy Temple had stood there. This was the location associated with God's special presence called the Shekinah. This was the epicenter of the Promised Land. In praying toward Jerusalem, the Jews identified with all that God had promised in regard to that special land. And we find in places like Psalm 137, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Well, Daniel went to prayer 3 times a day, which signifies a commitment to intensely seeking God. When committed to intense prayer, David prayed morning, noon, and evening. And note that his prayers incorporated the element of thanksgiving. In the New Testament, Paul says, in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Well, that was predictable. So consistent was Daniel in the place of prayer that even his enemies knew where they would find him. They knew they would find him there. It was so important to him. He had such convictions about prayer that they knew he would not compromise his prayer life, and he didn't. Daniel's prayer priorities really, I think, serve as a rebuke often to professing believers who seemingly value prayer so little. I mean, here was Daniel on threat of death in the place of prayer, while multitudes today who have great freedom to pray rarely, certainly not habitually, are in the place of prayer. Many who call themselves Christian really don't even have a regular quiet time. It's easy to talk about how important prayer is, but I'll tell you something. Practice reveals what you really value, what you really believe. J.C. Ryle said, "A person may preach from false motives. A person may write books and make fine speeches and seem diligent in good works, and yet be Judas Iscariot. But a person seldom goes into their closet and pours out their soul before God in secret, unless they are in earnest. The Lord himself has set his stamp on prayer as the best proof of true conversion." John Fletcher, who was a contemporary of John Wesley, was known to greet a friend by saying, "Do I meet you praying?" That's a great question. Do I meet you praying? From the plotter's perspective, Daniel fell right into their trap. But again, Daniel knew exactly what was happening, and he refused to compromise his prayer life. For Daniel, prayer was a lifestyle. It was a way of life. Verse 12. Okay, they caught him. Verse 12. "And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" The king answered and said, "The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." They were tricky, like slick lawyers, manipulating the king all the way. And notice they were very careful to start by asking this leading question. The king affirmed that indeed he had signed the decree in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be changed. Gotcha. They had the king right where they wanted him, and they had Daniel right where they wanted him. It seemed that their plan was working out perfectly. Verse 13, "So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." Now it all came out just that quick. Their anti-Semitism comes out. They did not refer to Daniel in terms of his elevated, dignified position, but rather as one of the captives from Judah. Derisively, they're making that comment. They make it personal, like he has no regard for the king or the decree that he has signed. It's a personal offense to you. And the treasonous charge was that he makes his petition to his God 3 times a day. He's putting his God over you. He's now has no regard for you. He's putting his God way up here. Verse 14. "And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him." The king was not upset with Daniel, but I think with himself. Instantly he saw that they had used him to frame Daniel. And he knew Daniel's character. He knew he was loyal. I'm sure he saw the jealous motives behind this, but what to do about it? I mean, he had just said, "Yeah, I made this decree according to the law of the Medes and the Persians. How do I get out of this? How do I get Daniel out of this?" He set his heart on delivering Daniel, who was really, I think, at this point, the most important helper he had in the whole kingdom. He labored all day to the going down of the sun to deliver him. Look for every possible loophole. How do we get out of this? Reynolds Showers says, "According to Oriental custom, a punishment must be executed on the evening of the day in which the accusation was made." Verse 15. "Then these men approached the king." He's been working all day to try to find a loophole. "Then they approached the king and said to the king, 'Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed.'" They're reminding, you're locked in here. You signed it. So these accusers pressed the king. And there must have been real tension in the air as the king knew full well what was happening. Legally, through flattery, they had trapped him. The law was on their side, the law of the Medes and the Persians. 3 times in this chapter, the emphasis is made concerning the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be altered. This was lawfare at its finest. I'm sure the king was feeling some serious resentment toward them for deceiving him in this way, because that's really what had happened. And that comes out at the end of the story, as we will see. Verse 16, so the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. The king had no choice. His entire credibility was on the line. So he gave the command, and they brought Daniel to cast him into the den of lions. Amazingly, the king sought to comfort Daniel, saying, your God, whom you serve continually. And note there's an emphasis here on Daniel serving this God continually. It was his whole life. He said, he will deliver you. You know what? That almost sounds like a statement of faith. Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. I mean, what a statement. The sense seems to be, I've tried everything, and now if you're going to be delivered, it must be your God who does it. Only it's a little stronger, because he says, he will deliver you. Now, this would suggest that Daniel had been witnessing to Darius, and that Darius knew something about Daniel's God. It was certainly clear that Darius desired Daniel to be spared. Verse 17, then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. The word den could also be translated as pit. The stone assured that Daniel was not going to get out of there. And the seal was a legal guarantee that no one could tamper with it upon pain of death. All the lawyers and the legalese people were there, making sure the letter of the law was followed. The king sealed it with his signet ring, and so did his attendant officials. Probably could hear the roar of the lions. I'm sure they were kept hungry. Verse 18, now the king went to his palace and spent the night in fasting. No musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. The great injustice done to Daniel weighed heavily on the conscience of the king. He didn't feel like eating or being entertained. He couldn't sleep. It was a long night. The irony is that while the king couldn't sleep, I'm pretty sure Daniel did get some sleep. I don't know, but I'll bet he did. Maybe sleeping on, those lions make for, nice pillows. Anyway, 19. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. I mean, a sleepless night, and here he gets very early, crack of dawn, here he is. He's going to see, hey, did Daniel survive? And notice the king is thinking about Daniel and Daniel's God. I mean, as they were getting ready to cast Daniel in, he said, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. And that suggests kind of an element of faith. He's still thinking about the God factor early in the morning. Coming in haste suggests he is hopeful that perhaps God has saved Daniel. I mean, why do you even go and ask, hey, Daniel, are you alive, if you don't believe that there's any possibility? Verse 20, he came to the den. He cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, the servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? This action also hints at faith. He cried out to Daniel, indeed in a lamenting voice, which is to say a sad tone, but nonetheless inquiring about whether God had delivered him. The very fact that Darius thought such a deliverance possible speaks of some semblance of faith. Note, Darius here referred to God as the living God, which is in contrast to all those gods that are not living, idolatrous gods. They're not living. Daniel's God is the living God. He had definitely heard some things about God from Daniel. In verse 16, he said he will deliver. Now in verse 20, he asked if the living God has been able. Verse 21. Then Daniel said to the king, "Oh, king, live forever." That must have been a start early in the shadowy morning. Of course, Daniel's greeting was really polite protocol court talk, but rather ironic. Daniel, humanly speaking, should have been dead. But here he is, early in the morning, vibrantly addressing the king with, "O king, live forever." And the king might have said, "And you too, O Daniel." Verse 22. Notice what Daniel says. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him," before God. "And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." So Daniel immediately credits his God with saving him. Now, let me ask you, how did Daniel know about this angel? Was he visible? I mean, there was the fourth man in the fire, as we saw earlier in chapter 3. Was he visible, this angel? Did he talk to Daniel? Daniel doesn't give any details other than an angel had shut the mouths of the lions. Now, this may simply have been a single angel, just a regular angel with incredible power. A single angel, you remember, killed 185,000 Assyrian warriors in one single night. We read in 2 Kings chapter 19, it came to pass on a certain night that the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. When the people arose early in the morning, there were the corpses, all dead. A single angel has incredible power. And this angel may also have been the pre-incarnate Christ in the form of the angel of the Lord, as we suspect the fourth man in the burning fiery furnace was in chapter 3. God uses angels to accomplish his purposes for his people, including protecting them. Hebrews 1:14 indicates that they are ministering spirits who minister on behalf of God's children, mostly in ways that we are unaware of. But how wonderful a truth this is. Psalm 34:7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. We don't know all that they're doing for us and how many times they spare us. And note that Daniel said God delivered him because he was innocent of doing anything against the king. Daniel claimed that faithful allegiance to God above all made him guiltless in this matter. That was not a crime. And clearly God vindicated him on this matter. Verse 23. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he believed in his God. The king really liked Daniel and was exceedingly glad that God had delivered him. It was a new day. He commanded Daniel to be removed from the pit. And amazingly, as they evaluated him, he was totally without any injury. Now remember, Daniel was an old man in his 80s. You know, I don't think they lowered him gingerly down into the pit. Verse 16 says they cast him into the den of lions. I think that was quite a drop. And yet, here he is, totally unharmed. You know, maybe he went bouncing down onto one of those big lions. Nice fluffy pillow. It was quite a drop, and yet here he is totally unharmed, not to mention spending all night with these hungry lions. Truly, it was a miracle that God had preserved him. We read about his faith here in the book of Hebrews, the Hall of Faith chapter, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promise to stop the mouths of lions. John Phillips says, it is interesting to know why God saved Daniel, because of his integrity, both Godward and manward, and because he believed. These are two great allies to have when all around the soul gives way. We do want to note this qualifier. Warren Wiersbe says, not every faithful servant of the Lord is delivered from trial and death in some miraculous way. Hebrews 11, 1 through 35 names some great men and women of faith and describes their achievements. But verses 36 through 40 describe others who also had great faith and yet were persecuted and martyred. God is God, and he describes the part he wants us to play in his masterpiece plan. Verse 24, and the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel and cast them into the den of lions. Them and their children, their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they even came to the bottom of the den. What a difference a day makes. The previous day, the king did what he was legally bound to do. But this was a new day. And on this day, he commanded the accusers of Daniel and their families be thrown into the lion's den. And boy, were they hungry. They tore in pieces these people even before they got to the bottom of the den, showing what an awesome miracle of preservation was performed by Daniel, for Daniel. Now, some suggest it was perhaps only the key ringleaders who were actually the main instigators who experienced this fate. Reynold Shower says, Persian rulers executed all of a man's relatives when he committed a crime worthy of death. This was a sure way of preventing assassination attempts upon the life of the king by disgruntled relatives in future years. Well, ultimately, people reap what they have sown. Wisdom principle, again from Proverbs 26, whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. Just like Nebuchadnezzar at an earlier time, this event of Daniel being delivered inspired Darius to write an open letter to all the people, far and wide. And notice what he said, verse 26. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. So he decreed that people must reverence this God who has revealed him so clearly in reference to Daniel. Now it is assumed that the king, what he decreed for everyone else, he first applied to himself, and then he makes what amounts to a powerful statement of faith. He declares this God to be the living God. Again, you know what living things do? They move. This God moves in history. He intervenes in the lives of his people. He is relational and active. He is for real. And I want to submit to you, he is still the living, moving God. And then he continues. He is steadfast, which means enduring. He is enduring forever. He is steadfast or enduring forever. This is a way of saying he is the eternal God. And his kingdom will not be destroyed. It's an everlasting kingdom. And his dominion, his sovereign control shall never end. Well, that's a pretty good doctrinal statement. Verse 27, he delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Notice what his statement of faith says. He's the living God, enduring forever, having an eternal kingdom. His sovereign control will never end. He is a God of deliverance. He is a miracle-working God. With the great proof of what? He has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Now, some question the faith of Darius because he spoke in terms of the God of Daniel. But we need to realize he is emphasizing this because of how God had so uniquely worked supernaturally in relationship to Daniel. That's the whole context. Daniel was the catalyst here. And yet the statements of affirmation here are from Darius himself and are very strong. I agree with Bob Deffinbaugh. There are differences of opinion here amongst conservative commentators. But I agree with Bob Deffinbaugh, who says the king's decree is similar to that of his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. It sounds something like the Hallelujah chorus to me. I cannot imagine these words coming from anyone other than a true believer in the God of the Jews. Such praise does not come from the lips of an unbeliever. I tend to think he was converted here too, as well as Nebuchadnezzar earlier, as we saw last week. You see, sovereignty is a lordship issue. The statement of Darius was a lordship statement, whereby he humbled himself under the truth of the God of Israel. This is where all Gentiles must come in order to be saved. It is further developed in the New Testament in relation to the Lord Jesus Christ. But this is a consistent testimony of faith in the God of Israel by a Gentile convert in the Old Testament. Verse 28, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus the Persian was the main ruler, but Darius the Mede for a time had a major sub-role ruling over the whole region of Babylonia. God preserved Daniel through the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, through the reign of Belshazzar, through the reign of Darius, and into the reign of Cyrus, who was God's chosen instrument to let the Jews return to their homeland. So what do we see by way of review here? Note the emphasis. Chapter 2, sovereign. God is sovereign. Confession of Nebuchadnezzar. Your God is a God of gods, the Lord of kings. Statement of sovereignty. Chapter 3, sovereign. You have the decree of Nebuchadnezzar. There is no God who can deliver like this. Chapter 4, sovereign. Testimony of Nebuchadnezzar. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. Chapter 5, sovereign. Statement of judgment. Many, many tekel upharsin. Hey, guess what? God's in charge. You're done. Chapter 6, the decree of Darius. His kingdom shall not be destroyed. His dominion shall endure. So what do we find here as we, kind of do an overview? We're talking about the times of the Gentiles. And the key lessons are 3. Number 1, God is sovereign over the nations. Number 2, God sovereignly preserves his people Israel. And number 3, God sovereignly uses his people Israel as his witness people. You know what? We're still living in the times of the Gentiles. And all 3 of these realities still remain in place. God remains sovereign over the nations. He still rules in the kingdom of men and sets up over it whomsoever he will. He is still preserving his people Israel in spite of themselves. At the end of Old Testament history in Malachi 3:6, God says, it is because he does not change that they are not consumed, that they, the Jews, are not consumed. And finally, God still uses Israel as his witness nation to the Gentile world. You see, in every chapter in Daniel 2 through 6, it was through the Jew that God made the truth of his sovereignty known. It's in conjunction with the Jews that this is put on display. Daniel the Jew revealed the king's secret dream involving world history, chapter 2. The Jewish children revealed God's sovereignty in the fiery furnace of chapter 3. It was through Daniel the Jew that Nebuchadnezzar's fate was revealed in chapter 4, showing that God is sovereign and rules in the kingdom of men. It was through Daniel the Jew that Belshazzar's fate was revealed in chapter 5 and was fulfilled that very night. And it was through Daniel the Jew that God's sovereignty was manifested in the lion's den of chapter 6. It is the Jews who are God's special witness people. God has chosen to reveal himself to the world, the Gentile world, through the Jews, even in the dark times of oppression known as the times of the Gentiles. It is through the Jews that God gave us the scriptures. It is through the Jews that we have prophetic truth. Amos 3:7, God says that he does nothing unless he reveals, quote, his secret to his servants, the prophets. Prophecy swirls about the Jews. It is through the Jews that we have the Savior. Jesus said salvation is of the Jews, John 4:22. And even though the church is also a witness people for God, we must always remember that we are merely grafted in branches, while Israel is the root, Romans 11. The truth of God in terms of revealed truth is centered essentially in Israel. You want proof of God? Consider God's great proof of himself. Yes, there is nature. Yes, but if you want proof of God concerning special revealed truth, look no further than Israel. Israel is God's great apologetic to the world. This is the message of Daniel, and it remains true to this very day. Israel is back in the land in fulfillment of prophecy. Last days truth swirls around Israel. God displays his sovereignty in various ways, but in terms of special revelation, essentially it relates to Israel. This is how God has chosen to communicate his truth to the entire Gentile world. A story is told about a family of mice. This is not a true story. A story is told about a family of mice who lived inside a large piano. All the dark spaces of their world were filled with sound and harmony. At first, the mice were impressed by it. They drew comfort and wonder from the thought that there was someone who had made music, though invisible to them above and yet so close to them. They loved to think about the great player whom they could not see. Then one day, a daring mouse climbed up part of the piano and returned very thoughtful. He had discovered how the music was made. Wires were the secret. tightly stretched wires of graduated lengths which trembled and vibrated. They must revise all their old beliefs. None but the most conservative could any longer believe in the unseen player. Later, another explorer carried the explanation further. Hammers were now the secret. Numbers of hammers dancing and leaping on the wires. This was a little more complicated theory, but it all went to show that they lived in a purely mechanical and mathematical world. The unseen player came to be thought of as a myth. But the pianist continued to play. During the times of the Gentiles, the God of Israel has largely been discarded in the minds of modern man. But his sovereign plan continues to play out. If you doubt it, watch Israel. Israel is God's great apologetic. Even in the times of the Gentiles, Israel is the key to God's program for the world. The Jews would be scattered throughout the world. They were. They as a people would be preserved. They were. They would come back to the land, first in blindness, which they have. Israel has to be back in the land in order for last days prophecies to be fulfilled. They are there. The unseen player continues to play out his sovereign plan in relationship to his chosen people, Israel. And he invites the whole world, saying, "Look to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other." Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose. Dare to make it known. God, help us to place our faith in the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, who has revealed himself ultimately in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's stand together and have our closing song.